Some lives are not lived, but performed. They are grand, public operas built on ambition, curated with the obsessive precision of a theatrical production. To choose this path is to treat existence as the most demanding performance of all, staged for a relentless audience whose approval is the only measure of success. But what happens when the carefully controlled stage lights are suddenly turned into the harsh, unforgiving glare of an interrogation lamp? What happens when the audience, no longer content with the show, decides to storm the stage, not to admire the intricate machinery of the production, but to tear it, and the lead actress, to pieces? This is the story of such a life, and of its spectacular public dismantling. It is the story of a woman who seemed to possess everything her era deemed desirable, staggering wealth that could purchase almost anything, a celebrated beauty that stopped conversations, a legendary title that bespoke centuries of history, and a social power that could make or break reputations with a single invitation. She was a woman who commanded the attention of continents, whose wedding could bring the city of London to a standstill, and whose self-possession was so formidable it was often described as frightening. And yet, this very woman, upon the discovery of a handful of private photographs found in a locked cupboard, was publicly and viciously destroyed. Her life's work of self-creation, a masterpiece of social artistry 30 years in the making, was turned to ash by the very society that had once built her up, adored her, and defined itself by her glamour. The scene of her unraveling was not a private bedroom filled with quiet grief, but a cold, wood-paneled public courtroom in Edinburgh. Her most intimate secrets were not whispered in confidence to a trusted friend, but were read aloud as legal evidence to be dissected, condemned, and then broadcast to a waiting world. And the instrument of her destruction was not a grand twist of fate or a classical tragedy, but a small, unassuming, and devastatingly modern piece of technology, a Polaroid camera. To the casual observer at the time, it was simply the society divorce of the century, a juicy piece of high-class gossip to be devoured over breakfast and then forgotten. To her friends, it was an unimaginable betrayal, a violation of the unspoken rules that governed their world. But to us, looking back now with the benefit of hindsight, the scandal is something more. It is the key that unlocks the life of Margaret, Duchess of Argyll, and in doing so it forces us to confront a series of unsettling questions that resonate even more loudly today. Can a person's identity become so profoundly intertwined with their public image that the destruction of that image constitutes a form of social death? What happens when the performance becomes the person and the mask becomes the face? This, then, is a psychological and sociological detective story. It is a search for the soul of a woman who poured all of her energy, her fortune, and her formidable will into making her life a masterpiece of social art, only to discover in the most brutal way imaginable that her magnificent creation was terrifyingly, fatally fragile. The legend of Margaret, the glamorous and controversial Duchess, was not born in the hushed corridors of an ancient castle, but forged in the soot and fire of a new and ferociously competitive age. Her story is one of breathtaking ambition, and to understand the woman who would one day become a byword for both high style and low scandal, we must travel back to the world that created her. We go back to the outskirts of Glasgow, Scotland, in the year 1912. Born Ethel Margaret Wigham on the 1st of December, she entered a world far removed from the ancient landed aristocracy she would one day join. This was not the Scotland of misty glens and inherited poverty, but the Scotland of the second city of the empire, a global powerhouse of industry where the clang of shipyards on the River Clyde was the prevailing anthem. This was the world of the new industrial elite, a class of titans who had built vast fortunes from coal, steel, and textiles. Their chapels were the factory floor and the boardroom. Their sacred texts were balance sheets. They were a society built on a potent and often contradictory mix of shrewd business, stern Calvinist grit, and a relentless, hungry pursuit of prestige. This combination created a fascinating psychological tension, a public face of piety and hard work, masking a private reality of ruthless commercial warfare. They believed their wealth was a sign of divine favor, a justification for their relentless drive. They were a class of people with everything to prove to the old guard who secretly looked down on them, and, in their own minds, absolutely nothing to lose in the fight to the top. Her father, George Hay Wem, was the architect of the family's fortune, and more importantly, its social aspirations. A self-made man of formidable intelligence and drive, he had risen from a modest background to become a millionaire and the chairman of the British Celanese Corporation, a giant in the revolutionary new field of artificial fibers. This wasn't just another textile company. British Celanese was at the forefront of the modern age, creating artificial silk or rayon, a product that promised to bring the luxury of high fashion to the masses. George Wigham was not just a manager, he was a visionary of industry, a man who understood the power of new technology to reshape the world. He had conquered the world of industry, but his true ambition lay elsewhere. He was determined to conquer the drawing rooms of London. He viewed society as a series of ladders, and he intended to climb them all. And in his beautiful only child, he saw the perfect instrument for this conquest. He knew that while his money could open doors, it couldn't, on its own, buy true acceptance from an English aristocracy that was notoriously suspicious of new wealth, particularly Scottish industrial wealth. For that, he needed something else entirely. He needed a princess of his own making. Margaret was not just his daughter. She was his masterpiece, his most precious investment, the vessel into which he poured all of his hopes for dynastic legitimacy in a society that still valued bloodlines over bank accounts. Her mother, Helen Manhane, came from a more established, though less wealthy background. She was expected to fulfill the role of a gracious society wife, managing the household and reflecting her husband's success. But the reality of the Wigham home was far from a warm, nurturing environment. It possessed the hushed chill of a well-managed museum. The marriage was a functional partnership governed by the cold calculus of social advancement. From her earliest years, Margaret absorbed a crucial formative lesson. Love was secondary to ambition. Emotion was a liability, and one's primary duty was to the flawless performance of a public role. Affection was a currency to be spent carefully, not given freely. The experience would instill in her a lifelong aversion to emotional messiness and a powerful drive to construct a future life that was impervious to such vulnerabilities, a life built of stronger, more reliable materials than human affection. She learned to see a display of vulnerability not just as a weakness, but as a strategic error. Margaret's upbringing was a meticulously planned campaign, a social grooming of almost scientific precision. She was educated not to be an intellectual, but to be an ornament. A legion of governesses and tutors polished her accent, perfected her posture, and taught her French. She was sent to the most exclusive finishing schools, including Heathfield and Ascot, and crucially, a finishing school in New York City, where she was presented to society. This transatlantic education was a strategic masterstroke by her father. It was the Roaring Twenties, and America was a world away from the starched collars and rigid protocols of London. There, Amidst the frantic energy of the Jazz Age, she didn't just learn etiquette, she absorbed an entirely different kind of confidence, bolder, brighter, and unburdened by centuries of tradition. It gave her the polish of the English upper classes, but also the confidence and modern glamour of an American heiress. She learned in the most visceral way that form dictates function, and that beauty in this context was not a matter of opinion, but a measurable indicator of superior social currency. She returned to Britain not just as a polished debutante, but as an exotic import carrying a spark of New World dynamism that made her utterly irresistible. It is perhaps one of the great ironies of Margaret's life that, for a woman who became a global authority on visual perfection, there was one element she could never entirely tailor to her will: her own speech. A slight yet persistent stammer followed her throughout her life, a private struggle hidden behind a public facade of dazzling self-assurance. One has to wonder if her legendary obsession with aesthetics, the perfect Hartnell gown, the flawless three-strand pearls, the immaculate decor of her homes, was a direct and brilliant compensation for this one uncontrollable flaw. If a spoken sentence could falter, her appearance never would. Her style became a language of its own, a fluent and powerful dialect of glamour that spoke for her when she feared her own voice might not. Her wardrobe was her armor, yes, but it was also her vocabulary. Each carefully chosen outfit, each piece of jewelry, was a declaration of intent, a perfectly enunciated statement of who she was, or rather, who she had decided to be. This single hidden vulnerability may well be the key to understanding her entire public persona, suggesting that the magnificent spectacle of her life was an elaborate and beautiful fortress, built to defend the one small part of her that she could not command. She was becoming a startling beauty with a dazzling smile, a mane of dark, glossy hair, and a tall, athletic build. But it was her vivacity, her sheer electrifying life force, that truly set her apart. She was witty, charming, and possessed an unshakable self-confidence that many found intoxicating, if not a little dangerous. This wasn't the quiet, retiring beauty the English aristocracy was accustomed to. She treated conversation like a sport and a drawing room like a stage. She was not a passive, demure beauty. She was an active, engaged participant in the social game, and she played to win. The poise, the charm, the wit, these weren't just personality traits. They were finely honed instruments, and she was already, even as a teenager, a virtuoso. In 1930, at the age of 18, she was launched into the London social season as a debutante. The season was a highly ritualized months-long marriage market for the daughters of the elite, a relentless circuit of balls, race meetings at Ascot, and presentations at court. She was not just a success, she was a phenomenon. In an era before the term celebrity was widely used, she became one. The press was obsessed with her, dubbing her the it girl of the season. Her face sold newspapers. Crowds would gather just to catch a glimpse of her leaving a Mayfair restaurant. To an England still bearing the psychic scars of the Great War and teetering on the edge of economic uncertainty, Margaret was more than just a pretty girl. She was an avatar of unapologetic life and beauty, a symbol of glamour in a gray world. She was pursued by a legion of suitors, and it's worth pausing to consider the sheer caliber and variety of the men she held in her thrall, for they represented the competing worlds of the age. There was Prince Ali Khan, the fabulously wealthy and exotic playboy prince, who offered a life of international glamour, of racetracks at Longchamp, casinos in Monte Carlo, and endless sun-drenched hedonism. There was the publishing heir Max Aitken, the future Lord Beaverbrook, A man who didn't just inherit wealth, but commanded the very media empire that was turning Margaret into a star. A romance with him was a dance with power itself, a complex game of seeing and being seen, orchestrated by the ultimate insider. She was courted by the solid, old-world money of banking heirs like Baron Bentinck, and chased by the daring new spirit of adventure embodied by the famous aviator Glenn Kidston. Each suitor was a king in his own right, offering her a different kind of kingdom to rule. She seemed to collect proposals, like a general collects battlefield trophies, each one a testament to her unparalleled social power. This wasn't just a search for a husband. It was a brilliant and intuitive public spectacle of her own desirability and control. She became the masterful stage manager of her own myth. She understood that being photographed at the opera with one, dancing until dawn with another, and being seen at Ascot with a third created a relentless storm of speculation that was far more valuable than any single engagement ring. Each refusal, reported breathlessly and with a hint of awe in the papers, only burnished her legend, transforming her from a beautiful debutante into an unattainable goddess. Her every move, every outfit, every rumored romance was chronicled in the gossip columns. One could almost picture her father, George Wigham, reading the morning papers, not for news of the stock market, but for the latest report on his greatest investment. She had spectacularly achieved his dream. She had not just entered the fortress of high society, she had taken the throne. But behind this glittering triumph, a dangerous psychological alchemy was at work. This early, intense exposure to public scrutiny taught her a lesson that would become the core of her operating system. That her value was directly proportional to the amount of attention she could command. In the addictive glare of the flashbulb, her sense of self was not being forged internally from character or conviction, but was instead being constructed by the echo of external adoration. A flattering newspaper mention delivered a euphoric rush. A day of being ignored was a taste of annihilation. Public approval became the only metric that mattered. This created a fragile identity, an external scaffolding of fame built around a hollow core. She was learning to exist only as a reflection in the eyes of others, and while the reflection was dazzling, it depended entirely on a constant source of light. It was a lesson that would have devastating consequences in the years to come, poisoning her relationships and leaving her incapable of finding contentment in the quiet, unobserved moments of a private life. The crown she had won was glorious, but it was also a curse. Long before she became the transatlantic Mrs. Sweeney, Margaret's heart had chosen a different, more English path. For a time, she was engaged to the Earl of Warwick, a match that, for a young woman, represented a genuine personal choice. But her father, George Wigham, ever the shrewd chairman of his family's destiny, saw it differently. He audited the books on his daughter's romance and found the Earl's pedigree to be stronger than his bank balance. The engagement was swiftly terminated. For Margaret, this was her first brutal lesson in the cold arithmetic of the world she was being groomed to conquer. It taught her that a title without immense wealth was a hollow prize, and that a young woman's affection was entirely secondary to her strategic value. Love, she learned, was a fleeting sentiment, but a powerful alliance was an asset that paid dividends for a lifetime. The experience didn't just teach her obedience, it taught her the rules of the game, a lesson that would profoundly shape every romantic calculation she would make from that day forward. Margaret's assault on the fortress of transatlantic high society began with a classic maneuver, one that revealed her pragmatic approach to relationships as stepping stones to greater glory. After a whirlwind of high-profile romances, she accepted the proposal of Charles Sweeney. He was not a duke, but he was handsome, wealthy, and crucially, American. The choice of an American was a masterstroke of personal branding. To marry into the British aristocracy was to be absorbed into a pre-written history, to become another link in an ancient chain. But Charles Sweeney represented something else entirely, a blank page upon which a new narrative could be written. Charles Sweeney was, in every respect, the answer to the strategic question of Margaret's future. He was a successful Wall Street businessman and a celebrated amateur golfer from a well-established Irish Catholic family on the American East Coast, a world away from the dusty pedigrees of the British peerage. In the 1930s, to be a champion, amateur golfer was to be a kind of royalty in itself, a symbol of the powerful, leisurely, and confident country club class that was coming to dominate the world stage. Sweeney embodied a new kind of American glamour that was intoxicating to a Europe weary of its own traditions. He was handsome, athletic, utterly self-assured, and unburdened by the anxieties of the old world. His charm wasn't the studied, ironic wit of an English aristocrat. It was direct, energetic, and optimistic. For Margaret, a woman who had been courted by the titled but often cash-poor men of Britain, Sweeney was a gust of fresh, invigorating air. Their courtship was less a whirlwind romance and more a high-profile merger, conducted in the full glare of the transatlantic press. This was a perfect match, but perhaps not one of the heart. He possessed a clean-cut athletic glamour that complemented her own meticulously curated beauty. Crucially, like her, he was new money, his family's fortune being as recent as her own. This put them on an equal footing, allowing them to become a modern power couple for a modern age. They were not old royalty, inheriting a dusty past. They were the new royalty of the 20th century, their reign built on glamour, wealth, media savvy, and ambition. Sweeney wouldn't overshadow her. He would enhance her. He was the ideal consort for her burgeoning empire of style. For Margaret, a young woman whose fame had perhaps outstripped her social standing, he was the perfect first acquisition. He was a strategic partner who would amplify the Margaret brand, not dilute it, providing a crucial bridge between the American elite and the British aristocracy, and solidifying her status as a transatlantic icon. Their wedding, on the 21st of February 1933, was not a private ceremony. It was a national event, a spectacle of almost royal proportions that served as the ultimate validation of their celebrity. The context of the moment is everything. This was the absolute depths of the Great Depression. Britain was a nation of queues, of hunger marches, of profound anxiety and grayness. Into this gloom, the Sweeney-Wyme wedding exploded like a flash of fantasy. The chosen designer was Norman Hartnell, a rising star in London couture who would later become the Queen's dressmaker. This commission would help cement his legendary status. He was tasked with creating her gown, and what he produced was an astonishing creation of white satin, with a 9-foot-wide, 30-foot-long train and a star-spangled veil, a nod to her new American connection. It was a masterpiece of construction, requiring a team of 30 seamstresses 6 weeks of intensive work to complete. The dress wasn't merely a wedding garment, it was a theatrical costume designed for the leading role in the grand play of her life, a public declaration of her unmatched status. The event was so anticipated that it brought the exclusive London district of Knightsbridge to a complete standstill for hours. A crowd, estimated at over 20,000 people, gathered outside the Brompton Oratory, a mass of ordinary Londoners pushing through police cordons simply for a glimpse of the bride. They were not there to protest the extravagance. They were there to participate in it. In the midst of such hardship, this unapologetic display of opulence wasn't seen as vulgar. It was a desperately needed fairy tale. The wedding was a public coronation. The moment Margaret Wigham, the industrialist's daughter from Glasgow, was crowned the undisputed queen of society. Inside the church, the guest list was a roll call of the transatlantic elite. She wasn't marrying into the establishment. She was creating her own rival court, built not on lineage, but on sheer, undeniable star power. The first decade of the marriage seemed to be a flawless embodiment of this glamorous ideal. It gave her 2 children, a daughter, Frances, and a son, Brian, and a platform for a lifestyle of almost unimaginable privilege. Together, the Sweeneys were more than a couple. They were a transatlantic brand, the living embodiment of modern moneyed glamour. They moved in a glittering world of country house weekends in the English countryside, where days were spent shooting and evenings were a blur of cocktails and bridge, ski holidays in the exclusive Swiss resort of St. Moritz, and long, languid summers on the French Riviera. Their inner circle was a fluid mix of old and new power, including everyone from the controversial Duke and Duchess of Windsor to Hollywood stars like Cary Grant and David Niven. Margaret became one of the most photographed women of her time, her style and beauty celebrated in the glossy pages of Vogue and Tatler. She was a tastemaker, a fashion icon, a woman whose every public appearance was a meticulously planned event. For Margaret, these photographs were not just mementos, they were proof of existence. They were a confirmation of her continued relevance in a world that had taught her that to be out of sight was to be out of mind. But behind the smiling photographs and the perfect facade lay a private history of almost unimaginable grief. The pressure in her world to produce heirs, specifically a male heir, was immense. While the public saw a family completed by a beautiful daughter and a handsome son, the private reality was a recurring cycle of hope and devastation. For every successful birth, there was a string of devastating losses. In all, Margaret endured no fewer than 8 miscarriages and stillbirths throughout her first marriage. This silent, recurring trauma, a profound physical and emotional ordeal that she was expected to bear with quiet dignity and without disrupting the social calendar, created a void that no amount of public adoration could truly fill. Beneath the perfect surface of their lives, the foundations of the marriage were fragile and deeply fractured. Sweeney, a man of his time and class, saw the marriage as a successful merger, a foundation from which to conduct the rest of his life. He had provided a home, wealth, and status. In return, he expected a gracious hostess and a dutiful wife and mother. He was a dedicated sportsman and businessman, often away from home for long stretches, pursuing his own interests on the golf course or in the boardroom. Margaret, however, saw the marriage as a stage, and she had no intention of leaving it. Trapped by the immense unspoken grief of her losses, and fueled by the psychological conditioning of her entire life, she found the conventional roles of wife and mother profoundly unfulfilling. The very lesson she had learned as a debutante, that her value came from a constant public adoration, now made private life feel like an empty, airless prison. The quiet domesticity of a grand house, empty of guests and with her husband away, was not a sanctuary. For her, it was a silence she couldn't bear. The contrast between a glittering party on a Saturday night and the long, unstructured emptiness of a Tuesday afternoon was a kind of psychological torture. She was a performer suddenly left without an audience, and the silence was deafening. Then, in 1943, a dramatic and life-altering event occurred. It happened not in a glamorous ballroom or on a speeding motor car, but in the mundane, quiet setting of a professional office. While visiting her chiropodist on Bond Street, Margaret had a near-fatal fall, plunging 40 feet down an empty elevator shaft. One moment, she was the picture of wartime elegance, navigating a city under the shadow of the Blitz. The next, there was only darkness and a terrifying impact. She suffered a fractured skull and a severe concussion. In the months that followed, the visible wounds began to heal. But some injuries are invisible, and they can change the very core of who a person is. Many of her friends and biographers believe the accident caused a profound and lasting change in her personality. It was reported that the fall damaged her olfactory nerve, leading to a total loss of the senses of taste and smell. For a woman whose life had been a symphony of fine wines, gourmet food, and expensive French perfumes, this was a devastating sensory amputation. She was now living in a muted two-dimensional world, cut off from the very pleasures that defined her class and lifestyle. But the most significant changes were deeper. Her friends noted a new impulsiveness, a recklessness that hadn't been there before. The carefully constructed persona of Mrs. Charles Sweeney, the perfect society hostess, began to show cracks. More controversially, it has been suggested that the brain injury may have exacerbated a pre-existing tendency towards promiscuity, leaving her with a heightened and less inhibited sexual appetite. Neurologically, we now know that damage to the frontal lobes of the brain can drastically affect judgment and impulse control. While this is impossible to prove definitively in Margaret's case, it adds a layer of tragic complexity to her later story. Was the behavior that society would later so viciously condemn a series of moral failings? Or was it, in fact, the tragic, uncontrollable symptom of a damaged brain? This question reframes her entire legacy, suggesting that the woman who was portrayed as a predator may have been, in part, a victim of a devastating physical trauma that dismantled the filters between her desires and her actions. The marriage never fully recovered from its internal strains and the aftermath of her accident. The bond, already more pragmatic than passionate, could not withstand the new pressures. By 1947, the fairy tale was over. The divorce was quiet and civilized, a stark contrast to the brutal legal battle that would later define her life. It was less the messy end of a great romance and more the mutual dissolution of a long-term business partnership. Both sides understood the value of a discreet exit. Margaret emerged in her mid-30s, still beautiful, still wealthy from a generous settlement, and most importantly, utterly independent. This was a novel position for a woman of her era. She was no longer anyone's daughter or anyone's wife. She was now simply Margaret Sweeney, a free agent with a fortune and a formidable reputation. With her independence secured, she re-entered the social fray, not as a young debutante, but as a mature and sophisticated woman of the world. The London of the late 1940s and early 1950s was a city emerging from the austerity of war, a city breathing out after years of holding its breath, hungry for a return to glamour and excitement. Into this gray landscape of bomb sites and ration books, Margaret was a splash of defiant color. She was a lone operator, answerable to no one, orchestrating her social life with the precision of a military campaign. She embarked on a series of high-profile affairs, including one with the American publishing tycoon Walter Annenberg. These were not merely romantic flings, they were alliances with men of immense power and influence, men who operated on her level. An affair was a confirmation of her place at the top table, but she was searching for something more than just a lover. She was searching for the ultimate social validation, the one prize that had so far eluded her: a title. For a woman who had conquered the world of new money and modern celebrity, there was one fortress that remained unbreached: the ancient hereditary world of the British aristocracy. A title was permanence. It was history. It was the one thing her father's millions could never purchase, and her own beauty could never guarantee. It was the final gleaming prize in the game she had been playing her entire life. The hunt was over. In 1951, she captured it. She met and quickly married her second husband, Ian Douglas Campbell, the 11th Duke of Argyll. With this marriage, the transformation was complete. Margaret Sweeney, née Wigham, the industrialist's daughter from Glasgow, was now Her Grace, the Duchess of Argyll. On paper, she had won the game. But this was not a storybook romance. It was a cold, hard transaction, and she had allied herself with a deeply damaged man. The Duke, while possessing one of the most ancient and revered titles in Scotland and the magnificent, crumbling ancestral seat of Inverary Castle, was a man in ruins. His reputation preceded him. Tales of his womanizing, his staggering gambling losses at London's most exclusive clubs, and his volatile temper were society legend. He had already been married and divorced twice. He was a notorious philanderer, a gambling addict, an alcoholic, and, most importantly, he was deeply in debt. Before Margaret, he had become embroiled in a shocking legal case trying to prove his nephews illegitimate so his own son could inherit the title. His character was not just flawed, it was deeply questionable. Inverary Castle was a perfect metaphor for the Duke himself, a breathtakingly beautiful facade that concealed deep structural rot, a money pit that had already consumed the fortunes of others. Margaret, in contrast, was a woman of immense personal wealth. The exchange was brutally simple. Her role was not to be a partner, but a patron, a restorer of crumbling stone walls, and a replenisher of a perpetually empty bank account. She gained a ducal coronet and the highest social standing in the land. He gained a lavish lifeline for his debts and his decaying legacy. In her ambition, she overlooked the flashing warning signs of the Duke's character. Perhaps after a lifetime of strategic maneuvering, she believed she could manage him like any other asset. More likely, her ambition had become a form of tunnel vision. In her single-minded pursuit, she saw the coronet, not the character of the man wearing it. To acknowledge the Duke's deep flaws would be to admit that the ultimate prize was tarnished. It was a truth she simply could not afford to accept. She had bought her title, but the price would be far higher than she could ever have imagined. With her marriage to the Duke of Argyll, Margaret's life transformed into a spectacle of aristocratic grandeur, a performance she had been rehearsing for her entire life. The post-war years, which brought continued hardship for many in Britain, were the backdrop for the zenith of her opulence. While much of the country was still grappling with rationing that lingered into the early 1950s, the Argylls lived in a different reality altogether. Their life was a public display of privilege, a world away from the realities of ration book Britain, a stark contrast that underscored the enduring power of the class system. The heart of their new empire was Inverary Castle, the ancestral seat of the Campbell clan on the shores of Loch Fyne. This was not a house. It was a private kingdom, a magnificent neo-Gothic fortress that had fallen into a state of advanced disrepair. Margaret, with the same single-minded determination she applied to all her projects, poured her vast personal fortune into its restoration. This was more than a renovation. It was an occupation. She was taking a crumbling symbol of the old inherited world and reviving it with the vigor of new money. She modernized its ancient plumbing and wiring, restored its priceless Beauvais tapestries, and redecorated its grand rooms with a lavish theatrical flair. She saw the castle not just as a home, but as a stage, the perfect setting for her role as a duchess. It was her greatest curatorial act, a physical manifestation of her social triumph. They also maintained a luxurious home in London's exclusive Mayfair district, a hub for the city's social season. Here, Margaret hosted events that blended aristocratic tradition with modern glamour. Life at Inverary and in London was run with the precision of a grand hotel. A vast staff of servants, butlers, and housekeepers catered to every need. Margaret was the undisputed commander-in-chief, overseeing every detail, from the daily menus to the seating plans for her legendary parties. An invitation from the Duchess of Argyll was the ultimate social validation. She curated her guest list like a master strategist, blending blue-blooded dukes with Hollywood royalty and American financiers. It was a summons to a world of glittering conversation, vintage champagne, and impeccable style. Margaret's personal style became a global phenomenon. She was a fixture on the international best-dressed lists, her image captured by photographers like Cecil Beaton, a brilliant photographer and a waspish diarist of society, was instrumental in crafting the Margaret myth. He understood that Margaret was not just a subject, but a co-creator of her own image. His portraits depict her not as a mere woman of fashion, but as a remote classical deity, a woman of such flawless, untouchable perfection that she seemed carved from a finer, cooler material than the rest of humanity. It was a brilliant, deliberate piece of propaganda, suggesting a woman above the messy realities of everyday life. The perfection was the point. It was also her armor. Her signature look, the upswept dark hair, the bold red lipstick, and, always, her 3-strand pearl necklace became iconic. The pearls, in particular, were more than jewelry. They were her trademark, an indispensable part of the Duchess's uniform. But the decade of her greatest triumph was also a decade of gathering darkness. The marriage, built on a transactional foundation, began to crumble under the weight of the Duke's alcoholism, his gambling debts, and his increasingly erratic and paranoid behavior. He was a deeply troubled man. Much of his instability was likely rooted in deep trauma. He was haunted by his experiences as a prisoner of war in Germany and prone to fits of violent rage. This inner torment manifested not as a plea for sympathy, but as unpredictable fury. Behind the closed doors of Inverary and their Mayfair house, the glittering performance gave way to a grim reality. The restored tapestries became silent witnesses to bitter accusations, and the grand halls echoed with a toxic mix of infidelity, emotional abuse, and festering resentment. Trapped in a loveless and often frightening marriage, Margaret sought solace and affection elsewhere, embarking on a series of discreet affairs. Following the unspoken rules of her class, these were a source of comfort, but also a dangerous vulnerability in a household governed by a suspicious and volatile man. This is not to label Margaret a victim or the Duke a villain. Their private lives were a complex web of mutual dissatisfaction and betrayal, a tragedy with two protagonists. But it is to place her in her historical context. It was the primary lesson she had learned as a child in her parents' cold, ambitious home. When the foundation is loveless, you must make the facade flawless. Her life of extreme aestheticism, her obsession with the perfect party and the perfect dress, was a desperate attempt to control her environment, to prove that she could still orchestrate perfection in one sphere of her life, even as her marriage descended into chaos. It was, in part, a profound and deliberate act of turning away, a choice to focus on the flawless surface while her own emotional world rotted from within. This detachment was her lifelong coping mechanism, a way of ignoring private chaos by perfecting the public performance. It was a survival strategy that had served her well, but one that was about to be tested in the most brutal and public way imaginable. Then, in 1959, the private hell became a public spectacle. The final act began not with a shouted accusation, but with a quiet, calculated act of violation. While Margaret was in New York, the Duke, consumed by a paranoid rage that had festered for years, arrived at their Mayfair home. He was not alone. With him was a locksmith, a man hired to perform a simple task that would have devastating consequences. The sound of a drill and the snap of a forced lock on a personal cupboard was the sound of a carefully constructed world coming to an end. This was not a crime of passion. It was a cold, premeditated search for ammunition. The Duke was a man preparing for war, and he was determined to find a weapon of annihilation. What he found inside that locked, unassuming piece of furniture would exceed even his own vindictive hopes. It would set in motion one of the most vicious and sensational legal battles in British history. A battle that would not only destroy a marriage, but would also lay bare the hypocrisy and the cruelty of the society that Margaret had tried so hard to conquer. Inside, among her private papers, the Duke discovered what he was looking for. First, her diaries. These were not mere appointment books. They were candid, often witty, and sometimes deeply personal accounts of her life, her frustrations, and her lovers. Her inner world, committed to paper, was now in the hands of her greatest enemy. But he knew words could be disputed. He was looking for irrefutable visual proof, and he found it in the form of a series of explicit Polaroid photographs. The technology itself was significant, instant, intimate, and modern. In an age of carefully composed studio portraits, the raw, unvarnished reality of a Polaroid was profoundly shocking. The most infamous of these images showed Margaret, wearing only her signature 3-strand pearl necklace, engaged in an explicit sexual act with an unidentified man whose head was deliberately cropped from the frame. The press quickly and crudely dubbed him the Headless Man. The photograph's devastating power lay in its shocking juxtaposition, the ultimate symbol of aristocratic poise, and her personal trademark, the pearls, worn in a moment of raw, uninhibited sexuality. The armor she had worn for decades had now become the most incriminating part of the crime scene. The identity of the Headless Man became a feverish national guessing game, a dark parlor game played out in Fleet Street headlines and Westminster whispers. Was it the government minister Duncan Sandys, Churchill's son-in-law? Was it the Hollywood star Douglas Fairbanks Jr.? The speculation implicated the entire establishment, turning a private affair into a matter of national security and prurient public interest. The Duke's divorce petition, finally filed in 1963, was an act of public vengeance, a declaration of total war. He wasn't seeking a quiet separation. He was seeking her complete and utter annihilation. By releasing the diaries and the photographs to the court, he ensured that the world's media would be granted a front row seat to the most intimate details of his wife's private life. The subsequent trial became a cultural circus, a national obsession that pushed international crises off the front pages. The courtroom in Edinburgh, with its dark wood and ancient traditions, became a theater, and Margaret, always impeccably dressed in a new outfit each day, sat in silence as her private life was dissected before the world. In a devastating blow, her own mother, Helen, testified against her, questioning her daughter's character in a final public act of maternal abandonment. The judge, Lord Wheatley, a man of rigid, almost ascetic moral conviction, presided over the proceedings. He saw himself not just as an arbiter of the law, but as a guardian of public morality, a bastion against the coming tide of permissiveness. He cast Margaret not as an unhappy wife, but as a serpent in the garden of decency. His final judgment was less a legal ruling and more a public stoning, delivered as a blistering 3-hour tirade. He condemned her in scathing, almost hysterical terms, calling her a completely promiscuous woman whose sexual appetite could only be satisfied with a number of men. He described her behavior as disgusting, perverted, and wholly immoral. To fuel this narrative, the Duke provided the court with a list of 88 men with whom he alleged she'd had affairs. The number was grotesquely inflated, a piece of character assassination so extreme it bordered on the surreal. The list was said to include men she had barely met, prominent homosexuals, and powerful figures who could not defend themselves. The truth didn't matter. It was a flood of mud meant to overwhelm and stain her permanently. The press, in a frenzy of self-righteous glee, printed every sordid detail, cementing the narrative of the dirty Duchess who had betrayed her husband, her class, and her country. In a world still bound by rigid patriarchal sexual mores, where a man's infidelities were a private matter but a woman's were a public crime, Margaret was to be made an example of. The Duke's own well-documented philandering was never mentioned in court. The scandal was more than a broken marriage. It was a cultural event, a collision between the emerging sexual revolution of the 1960s and the last vestiges of aristocratic hypocrisy. Coming on the heels of the Profumo affair, the public had a ravenous appetite for stories that exposed the decadent secrets of the ruling class. Margaret, an aristocrat by marriage but not by birth, was a perfect target. The press, sensing this shift in the public mood, used the license granted by the court to destroy a woman who had for a lifetime projected an image of untouchable perfection. Her reputation was irrevocably shattered. The Duchess of Style was gone, replaced forever by the Duchess of Shame. The performance was over, the curtain had fallen, and the audience, which had once adored her, was now calling for her head. And the weapon that brought the entire gilded structure of her life crashing down was that little, unassuming Polaroid camera. The legendary writer Truman Capote, the great chronicler and eventual executioner of high society, was fascinated by the public downfall of beautiful, powerful women. He called them his swans, and in Margaret, he saw the ultimate cautionary tale. Her fate confirmed his darkest views on the savage, unforgiving nature of the world he documented. His verdict on her was a chillingly perfect summary of the event. Margaret is proof that a small camera can sink a great castle. The analysis was flawless. The small camera was the modern, instant, and intimate Polaroid that had captured her private moment. The great castle was not merely the stone and mortar of Inverary, which she had so lovingly restored with her own fortune, but the entire fortress of her social standing, her dignity, and the meticulously constructed life she had spent decades building. The quote speaks to the very modern nature of her fall, a life's work, a lifetime of curation and performance, undone by a single mundane piece of technology and the vicious public judgment that followed. She was a woman of the old world, destroyed by a weapon of the new. When the Duchess of Argyll finally emerged from the legal and media firestorm, she was a changed woman, a ghost haunting the ruins of her own life. The brilliant hard certainty that had been her hallmark, the unshakable confidence that had captivated and intimidated London for 30 years, had been replaced by a quiet, melancholic resignation. The public shaming had done its work. It had broken something fundamental within her. She was immediately and ruthlessly shunned by many of her former friends. Her real crime in their eyes was not infidelity, a common currency in their circle, but the unforgivable sin of getting caught so publicly and so squalidly. She had broken the aristocratic code of silence, allowing the grubby outside world a look into their private affairs. She was now a liability, a walking reminder of their own vulnerability. To be seen with her was to risk being tainted by her scandal. The invitations stopped coming. The phone calls went unanswered. In the exclusive restaurants where she once held court, her arrival would be met with averted eyes and a sudden, chilling silence. She had suffered a social death, which for her was a fate worse than any other. Compounding this isolation was her financial ruin. Her vast personal wealth, the very foundation of her power and independence, was decimated by the ruinous legal fees of a divorce that had dragged on for years. The great fortune her father had built to launch her into society was ultimately consumed by the inferno her life in that society had created. The money that had bought her a duke and restored his castle was now gone, spent defending herself against the man she had saved from bankruptcy. Her life entered a long, quiet diminuendo. The grand house in Mayfair, the scene of so many legendary parties, had to be sold. She moved into a smaller, more modest residence and eventually a hotel suite. The grand parties, the international travel, the couture gowns, all became relics of a past life. To make ends meet, she was forced into a series of humbling acts. She opened her home for paid tours, a surreal and tragic performance for a woman who had once commanded armies of staff. She became a tour guide in the museum of her own life, pointing out treasures to curious strangers in rooms that had once hosted kings and movie stars. The performance continued, but the audience and the stage had tragically shrunk. In a move that signaled the true depth of her fall, she even tried to capitalize on her notoriety, lending her name to advertising campaigns for household products. The Duchess of Argyll, once a global symbol of bespoke elegance, was now a commodity, her tarnished name used to sell wares to the very public that had delighted in her destruction. The magic was gone. The aura of untouchable glamour had been extinguished forever. Her final years were marked by a profound loneliness. The flashbulbs had long since faded, the society columns had new names to print, and the world had moved on. The swinging 60s, which her trial had in some ways foreshadowed, had given way to the cynical 70s and the brash 80s. She was no longer a symbol of glamour, but a ghost of a bygone era, a living relic of a world that had vanished. She was a duchess in exile, her final kingdom a single room in a London nursing home, its quiet, institutional corridors a universe away from the grandeur of Inverary Castle. It was said that, even in her final days, she never lost the bearing of a duchess, the performance continuing long after the audience had gone home. When a journalist once asked her late in life what she thought of modern permissiveness, she replied with characteristic acidity, "We didn't do those things. We were too busy vomiting," a shocking, witty, and perhaps tragic reference to the eating disorders prevalent in her circle. She passed away on July 26, 1993, at the age of 80. The woman whose life had been a public spectacle died off stage, in private, almost anonymously. There was a profound and tragic irony in her passing. The birth of her public self as a debutante, the coronation of her first wedding, and the brutal theater of her divorce had all been front-page news. Her death, by contrast, was a footnote. The obituaries, when they appeared, were predictable in their focus and revealed how completely the scandal had defined her. Headlines read, The Dirty Duchess dies at 80, or A Symbol of Scandal Fades Away. They were not tributes to a style icon or a formidable social figure. They were post-mortems of a scandal. Every article led with the 1963 divorce case, dutifully recounting the story of the headless man, the explicit Polaroids, and Lord Wheatley's searing judgment. Her dazzling youth as the it girl of the 1930s was treated as a nostalgic prelude to the main event, and her decades of decline were presented as the inevitable, moralizing conclusion. The press, the very institution that had built her into a goddess and then torn her down as a devil, now had the final word. They sealed her legacy, reducing a life of dazzling, complex ambition into a single, sordid, tabloid narrative. The public's response, if it could be measured at all, was a murmur, not a roar. For those old enough to remember the trial, the news of her death was a jolt of nostalgia, a name from the past that evoked a black and white world of aristocratic secrets and moral outrage. Her story was a landmark of their own youth, and her passing was another reminder of how much time had gone by and how much the world had changed. For a younger generation in 1993, a generation raised on the constant rolling scandals of modern celebrity and a more liberal sexual morality, her name meant little. The scandal that had shocked the nation 30 years prior now seemed almost quaint, a relic from a stuffy, repressed era. The quiet indifference that met her death was perhaps the final, cruelest judgment of all. It confirmed that the society she had sacrificed everything to conquer had not only cast her out, but had, in the end, erased her. To attempt a simple verdict on Margaret, Duchess of Argyll, is to fundamentally misunderstand her. She was a creation of dazzling complexity, the ultimate product of her time, her class, and her upbringing. She was the ruthless social strategist her father had engineered her to be, a woman who saw relationships as transactions and society as a ladder to be climbed. Yet she was also a woman capable of great passion and a desperate, lifelong search for the affection that had been absent in her childhood. She was a woman of iron control who curated every aspect of her public image, and a woman of profound vulnerability whose life was ultimately undone by her own private needs. Her rise was a testament to the power of a perfect facade, but her fall was a deeply human story about the brutal hypocrisy of a society that holds women to an impossible standard of purity. The headless men, whoever they were, remained respected figures in the establishment. Their power and reputations were fireproof. Hers was not. The scandal was not an endnote. It was the key to her entire existence. It was a brutal morality play, with Margaret cast as the villainess so that society could feel clean. It was the moment the public performer was forced to confront the complete and total destruction of her life's work. She had treated her life as the highest form of art, her own body and persona as the medium. But in the end, her masterpiece was judged and condemned by a society that preferred to punish a woman's private life rather than acknowledge its own public failings and its own prurient obsessions. Her story in many ways was a prophecy of the age to come. In a world now dominated by social media, curated identities, viral shaming, and the permanence of a digital footprint, the cautionary tale of the Duchess of Argyll feels more relevant than ever. She was the analog victim of a digital age crime. She stands as a glittering, profound meditation on the construction of the self and the terrible price of public perfection. She was her own greatest masterpiece, a work of breathtaking beauty and heartbreaking fragility, whose legacy endures as a powerful symbol of the immense and often cruel power of public judgment.